Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for joining us. So I'll just give a little bit of background. Um, Professor Sanderson is a professor of psychology at Amherst. And she and I connected on what used to be Twitter. Um, back when it was still, I think, a useful connecting tool. Back in like 2018 or something.
Right. Ages ago,
Yeah,
pre-COVID.
pre-COVID. And I had just dashed off the thread, I think, about kind of how I was seeing complicity play out in the Trump administration, which basically has 6 years later has turned, into the book that I'm writing. And I can't remember if you reached out or someone connected us. Um, because your research focused on bystanders, like the psychology of bystanders, why people stand by and don't do what they know is right. And so you and I, were connected on Twitter and had some exchanges there. And you were in the process at that time of writing your book. It is an excellent book, Why We Act, turning bystanders into moral rebels. It's fascinating, really fun to read. So I highly recommend that you pick it up. But you were my obvious first choice to kick off this sort of, I'm trying to do this speaker series so that
Mhm.
people, we're sitting here watching and trying to understand what's making these people behave the way that they do. So I want to kind of bring on people who to unpack some of that. And I'm using your research and other people's for my own book that I'm writing.
Mhm.
And then I'm trying to complement this with actual moral rebels in our current
Mhm.
moment
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
come on to kind of talk about their
Mhm.
like firsthand experience. So it's an experiment, but I'm excited to kick it off with you. And thank you so much for being on.
Well, again, as I said before we got started, this is such an urgent time to talk about moral rebels, and it's funny and frankly a little bit sad that when you and I connected before, and when I wrote this book, it was Trump's first administration,
Yeah.
and and who would believe that here we are in the second administration, and by all accounts, every single day it seems to be getting worse. So I'm excited about your work. I'm excited about the speaker series. I'm excited about your upcoming book because we really need people who can speak up in all sorts of circumstances, politically, but also in other cases.
Yes. So maybe just to kind of add some background, can you talk about what made you get into this field of study? Is this what you study? Like, I've read your book. Is your book part of a larger research
Yeah.
agenda, or is this bystander psychology kind of your focus?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I was an undergraduate at Stanford. I was a graduate student at Princeton. Asha and I also, share that Go Tigers connection. And when I was at Princeton, my work really focused on social norms. So not bystanders, but social norms. So how do social norms lead people to drink more than they should because they think everyone else is drinking? Or how do social norms contribute to women having problems with disordered eating because they have to achieve this faux thinness norm in the media? So my work really focused on the link between social norms and how it played out in health behavior. But my wonderful advisor, who has now passed, was John Darley, and John Darley is very famous in the field of psychology, far more famous than I am, because of his work on the bystander effect. And he was one of the people who really originated this field. I know some of your audience may be familiar with the case of Kitty Genovese, a woman who was stabbed to death in New York City, which is sort of commonly described as the start of the bystander effect. So honestly, my work was on social norms, but John, of course, was this giant figure within the bystander field. And so I was highly familiar with it, because of his mentorship, basically.
Awesome. And I want to get to social norms in a second, but can you please explain the bystander effect? What that means as a phenomenon, how it shows up, um, and maybe some of the critiques or different,
Mhm.
iterate, how when those experiments have been replicated, other findings that have built on that.
Sure, great question. So the bystander effect, as it was sort of traditionally and historically called, was really this tendency of people in a group setting to fail to speak up if there were other people present. So basically being like, ooh, that's a problem, but it's not my problem. And that was how it was described again in the famous case of Kitty Genovese, in which heartless New Yorkers, supposedly didn't call the police when this young woman was being attacked and stabbed. And so the bystander effect, sort of historically in the field of psychology, has been described as people's tendency to not step up, whether it's speaking up or whether it's acting up, taking action in some way in different emergency settings. Now, there is certainly some evidence now suggesting that, in fact, some people did call the police in the case of Kitty Genovese. It was probably not accurately recorded. There's also been some evidence now suggesting that in some situations people do speak up, and I think we can frankly see that playing out in public in lots of different ways now. But we still know that it's a very strong tendency of human nature to worry about fitting in, and that means that in some cases our tendency to not speak up may not be driven so much by this fear of, oh, it's not my responsibility, but really maybe be driven by other factors, which I try to unpack.
Great. So then let's talk about social norms, right? And how those play, because what it sounds like what what you kind of talk about is that oftentimes the bystander or the person is aware. We're not talking about necessarily people who have like no moral compass, right? There are
Right.
those, and I think that might be a different phenomenon, right? We're talking about people who do recognize the morally problematic situation in front of them. And you use some ordinary everyday situations like fraternity parties where, a woman is being assaulted, for example, by members of the fraternity, and there are people there. There are other members, I mean, who don't want to participate, don't know that what's happening is wrong, but then st don't intervene, for example.
Mhm.
May later actually end up becoming complicit by helping cover it up, even. Okay. But we're talking about people who do recognize that what they're doing is wrong. Um, so, so there's like the disconnect between what someone believes or know that they should do and this kind of big system or something that feels like they can't stand up to it or they
Mhm.
some so where do social norms fit in,
Mhm.
because and then we can talk. I want to separate social norms from things like agency
Mhm.
and empathy, which I think are a little bit different, but go
Mhm.
ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So to me, I think there are three key things that drive inaction in precisely those type of everyday situations you're describing. One, people actually don't know what's going on. So sometimes we see something. So your example was somebody being assaulted. We recognize that's problematic. But in other cases, we might recognize somebody making a joke or somebody making a comment or somebody being a little bit handsy. And we sort of think, is that consensual flirting or is that sexual harassment? Or is that person just drunk? Or are they actually unconscious? Or is that joke funny or is it really kind of racist or sexist? So in some cases, we honestly don't know how to interpret something. And so when we don't know how to interpret something, we look around to see, well, what are other people doing? And that's where the social norms come into play. But the problem is if everybody is like, well, I don't know how to interpret this, but everyone is kind of doing a poker face of trying to pretend like, I'm not concerned, I'm cool, whatever. That's where you can individually have lots of people being like, that's awful, but nobody actually speaks up. So that's one situation. The second situation is people recognize it's a problem, but they don't say it's my responsibility. Maybe you're on an airplane or in a restaurant or, in a classroom and you see something problematic, but you're like, not the pilot, you're not the police, you're not the teacher, you're not the person. So you think I don't have to do so. And then the third factor, and this is one that more recent research in neuroscience has provided really interesting data on, and that is that we fear the consequences. We fear if I call out my fraternity brother, stop, doing that, then we're going to be rejected. We're going to be ostracized. If I call out a colleague for saying a joke that's homophobic or sexist, maybe they're not going to like me. Maybe I'm not going to get a raise. Maybe I'm not going to get promoted. And so, what the research now shows in neuroscience is that being socially rejected, being ostracized or rejected from your group, your peer group, your colleagues, your family, whatever, actually activates the exact same part of the brain that is activated when you feel physical pain. So that means that we are hardwired as people to not want to speak up or challenge problematic behavior if we think that there will be consequences of doing so, because it literally feels in the brain like physical pain.
So there's so much there to unpack. So let's take each of those one by one,
Sure.
and kind of connect it to some other themes that you talk about in the book. So the first one where you say that people don't know what's going on, they're looking for other people to kind of signal, right? That like confirmation, like this is effed up, we need to do something.
Yes.
And you call it pluralistic ignorance.
Mhm.
It's like everybody's kind of in the same boat, but you're not sharing the information, so nobody realizes that everybody's in the same
Mhm.
boat.
Yeah.
So, number one, how do we correct for that? And number two, I'm thinking about also the ways in which social norms slowly can actually shape people to accept certain behavior. So, for example, one of the case studies that I'm looking at is Enron, smartest guys in the room.
Mhm.
And you have people who come in and are slowly socialized into a culture where cutting corners and anything that makes money and raises. So it's like they don't come in that way, but there is this gradual socialization. So I'm wondering if that pluralistic ignorance can actually be kind of a gateway to normalization.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That when we talk about bad behavior, it's often this sort of slippery slope, right? That it kind of starts off and then it escalates and then it escalates. And I mean, we certainly see that playing out in the Trump era, right? That, it started off with, well, I'm going to fire Jim Comey and let's kind of see how that happens. And now it's just escalated in that, more and more people, are getting fired, in sort of all walks of life. And so I think that you're exactly right, that it's a slippery slope. When somebody joins a fraternity, they sort of are like, okay, what are the norms? How do I fit in? And then gradually it sort of escalates. And then eventually over time, they're in charge of doing that. The Enron example, is a great one, as are many different cases. I mean, the blood doping scandal of Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes, same kind of
Yeah.
thing. People walked in and then it's kind of like, no, 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 well, that's okay. We're just going to fudge this because we're going to work it out later. And it's really this slippery slope to bad behavior. And that's often described as sort of the frog in boiling water effect, right? That you sort of are like, oh, it's not that big a problem, et cetera. And it just escalates.
Yeah. And so on that point, in terms of, how to stop that, one of the things that you talk about is why it's important to speak up even when there are those like in those early stages.
Right. Because the thing is that it's far easier to speak out in the early stages because if you don't speak out, then you have to justify why did I not speak out before? And I think you frankly see things like, I think you see Lindsey Graham in this situation where, initially he called out Trump a lot, but then he completely changed his tune. And now it becomes very hard to stand up to him because he kind of went down this pathway. And the famous Milgram shock study, done at Yale that I imagine a lot of your audience is familiar with, was studying obedience. And what they found was that if you started on this pathway of I'm just delivering this shock, supposedly a shock to an innocent victim, 15 volts. Oh, 15 volts is just nothing. 30 volts, that's not, 45. But so those were little things. And so it was not really a very big deal. But then if you started down that pathway and then it got to 200 volts, 250 volts, and so on, it became very, very hard psychologically for people to withdraw. And that's what you see time and time again in real world examples is once you start down that path, if you don't speak up early, psychologically you've kind of committed to this path and you have to justify your past failure to speak up and inaction.
Because that rationalization process starts even in that first step, right? I mean, when I was reading this, what immediately I thought about was when I was a counterintelligence agent in the FBI and we would recruit people to commit treason. And you don't get someone to commit treason by being like, "Hey, will you commit treason and please like give me all your classified information?" You start with something just very small, that's just ever so slightly compromising, a little bit of a, ethical no-no on their part, right? But
Hmm.
something that they might be able to justify to themselves.
Right.
And once they did that, we knew that they had were already on the road to scripting themselves to take the next step and then the next step. And so by the time they are giving you the classified information and they are committing treason, they have convinced themselves that they are doing, whatever it is. So because, and maybe you can just talk about cognitive dissonance here, because this is all like nobody who's in, like, the sources I recruited were not like, I am a traitor. They thought they were a patriot. So they
Right.
have to find a way to reconcile this positive self-image of themselves with this terrible action that they're taking or path that they're taking. So maybe you can unpack that, because I think that's the thing with Lindsey Graham, right? Like Lindsey Graham at this point, he's drunk the Kool-Aid. We talk about drinking the Kool-Aid. Drinking the Kool-Aid means that he's now bought in because
Mm,
he has to stick with his story, his rationalization, because
mm.
to abandon the story would be to confront something that, it's like looking into the sun. Like he may, it takes a lot. We can talk about reversing it later, but maybe cognitive dissonance and the rationalization.
Right. So there's so much in that. And actually, Asha, as you said, the example of drinking the Kool-Aid, of course, drinking the Kool-Aid is an expression from precisely what happened in Jonestown.
Yes.
I mean, that
Yes.
was like when you gave that, which is not in my book. I don't talk about Jonestown in my book. I don't believe I talk about Jonestown in the
I don't
book.
think you do. No.
But Jonestown, of course, is a perfect example of a group buying into this idea of this is the leader. We are going to do the right thing, and we are going to drink the Kool-Aid, even if it is laced with cyanide, and even if it's going to kill us. So I think it's not accidental that your expression of drink the Kool-Aid is hearkening back to sort of this massive, example
Self-delusion.
of
Yeah.
self-delusion and self-delusion to the extent that you will kill yourself, that you will
Yeah.
literally drink Kool-Aid laced with cyanide. I mean, that's literally the example. And so that's what we see again and again with people who have gone down this pathway and they then have to justify what they have done. I actually, and this is not in the book because, of course, it happened post the book publication, which was April of 2020, but I testified to investigators in the January 6th committee. And that particularly, they were interested in all of these people who absolutely saw themselves as patriots. They did not see themselves as violent rioters attacking the Capitol and defecating on Nancy Pelosi's desk or whatever. They saw themselves as correcting a wrong, that the votes were fraudulent, that the election had been stolen, and they were, in fact, acting in a righteous way. And that again is about this justifying of cognitive dissonance. It's not I'm a violent person who's attacking the Capitol and hanging, threatening to hang the vice president. It is I am doing the righteous thing, and that's how people justify their problematic behavior. I frankly think we see that with what's happening with ICE right now. I believe that many ICE agents are seeing themselves as we are doing worthy work of ridding America of people who are violent criminals and here illegally and so on. I believe that they are seeing their actions as justified because of this so-called better goal, and that is exactly how human nature, we want to resolve this cognitive dissonance. No one wants to see ourselves as I am kind of a weak and spineless, bad person who does bad things. It's very, very hard psychologically to hold that tension within yourself.
I'm so glad that you used the example of ICE, because I also think that that links to the power of propaganda, right? Because what propaganda does is it provides the rationalization that you need to use to help justify what you're doing, right? If you look at these DHS advertisements, we're protecting the homeland, we're protecting the heritage, America's under attack. And so it's giving people the story that they need to tell themselves. Like what I did with my, recruited spies,
Mhm.
you have to give people a story
Yeah.
to help
Yeah.
them go down the path. And, it's interesting because in my research on complicity, I'm kind of going into a lot of the Holocaust literature and Nazi Germany, and how much of that was, you know, people being very enthusiastically ratting out neighbors, because they really thought the propaganda was so powerful that they were able to convince themselves that that was just not wrong. There's dehumanization and other uh, cognitive manipulation that's happening there, too, that we also see in what DHS is doing. So that gets to the pluralistic ignorance and how that can lead to normalization,
Mhm.
right? Because as you're trying to figure this out, there's other people giving you the narratives that help you make sense of what is happening and justify it.
Mhm.
Let's talk about the second thing, where the people who are like, it's not my responsibility.
Mhm.
Because this is another, it's a different kind of rationalization. It's diffusion of responsibility or displacement of responsibility, right? You basically say, yeah, there's nothing I could do. It kind of gets to agency and people believing that they lack agency. Like, if I were to step up, it would not make a difference.
Mhm. Right.
So unpack that. Where does that come from? Um, because I hear that a lot, actually, in our current moment. I mean, from people who are very, they're not, Trump supporters, or, but it's almost like they just, it seems to me that they don't want to grapple with the moral issues and uh, what it means for them as as a moral duty. So they tell themselves that nothing they do is gonna matter.
Right. And I think the reality is that we can be overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation and then think I'm just, a single person. I can't possibly make a difference. That frankly is the reason why most Americans typically don't vote, right? So if you look at, voter turnout, sometimes voter turnout is 55, 60%, but still a lot of Americans are not voting. And that's in part because you think, well, my one voice, it's not going to make a difference, that's not going to matter, in that way. And I will say in situations in which people don't think their words are going to make a difference, they're very unlikely to speak up because doing so, seems pointless. Why would I why would I want to risk that? I think the key thing that many people fail to understand is that one person speaking up can actually often inspire other people to do so. And that goes back to what we just talked about with pluralistic ignorance. So, for example, if you think like, hey, I'm in this fraternity or I'm on this lacrosse team or whatever, and like, I think what these people are doing is really like racist or sexist or whatever, you might think, well, I'm just one person. But if you speak up and say, hey, you know what? I have a sister, like, this is really not cool. For all you know, a bunch of other people are going to be like, yeah, I totally agree. Like, yeah, that's totally right. And then, in fact, you get this shift in terms of other people supporting you and other people speaking up. And then you can actually see this change of the tide in that way. I think the key is that it's very hard to be the first person, and the first person worries about what the reaction will be. But if you can shift the tide and speak up, you often can get other people who actually agree with you, but they've just been really quiet about it.
Yeah. And I just want to emphasize right there, Catherine, that this is why in complicit systems, anyone who tries to speak up is immediately quashed and threatened because it is so dangerous to the system, precisely for the reason that you mentioned, right? That it is really important to keep the silence, to keep people in this pluralistic ignorance, to keep them atomized. One of the things that I've been looking at is particularly in these cases of sexual assault, where there's like systemic sexual assault, like Harvey Weinstein, like NDAs were intended to serve this purpose, to keep these victims atomized so that they're never able to share their stories, right? Because what broke open Harvey Weinstein? It was Me Too
Mhm.
on social media. Fine, people
Mhm.
being one person saying it and then other people saying me too, me too, me
Mhm.
too, me too.
Mhm.
I mean, me too is kind of exactly the phenomenon that you're talking about. Um, so yeah, so this idea of, speaking up and I guess courage is contagious.
Yes, courage is contagious, and I think courage is contagious in part because you are diffusing the pluralistic ignorance idea. I'm not the only one who sees this as a problem. I'm not the only one. And many times you see in your example of Harvey Weinstein, of course, is excellent. That's also what we see in terms of what happened with Jeffrey Epstein. It's
Yes.
also what we see in terms of what happened with the Olympic gymnast
Yeah.
doctor, in which there were, I don't know, 300 or some, giant number of young girls, who were
Like
assaulted by
over
this.
500.
Yeah,
Yeah.
over five. I mean, for decades. I mean, for a long period of time. But each of them thought it's just me, or each of them thought if I speak up, I'm going to not be on the Olympic team, which is,
That's right.
certainly possible. And so I think in time and time again, what you need is someone speaking up and saying this is not okay, and then that person is often punished. But then, if enough people go down that path. So I'm struck by, and I haven't read the paper this morning, but I'm struck by, I think yesterday, like six prosecutors in Minneapolis resigned.
Yes.
And as it was being reported, it was like prosecutor resigns, three prosecutors resign, six, and then it was, at some point yesterday it was six. And so it's like
Yeah.
what you see, and that's also an example of one person saying, "I'm not going to do this." Also models for other people, this is the right action. That moral courage is contagious.
Yeah. People should feel free to raise their hand. I'm curious if you've ever experienced this in like your own settings where either you said something, in some situation, and other people were like, I'm so glad you said that.
Mhm.
I have experienced that where I've said, called somebody out on something, and even if it's right, not right there, where people are like, yeah, I agree, they come after and they're like, thank you for saying that, and you kind of realize that there were other people who felt that. So feel free to share in the chat as well. Okay, so that's the diffusion of responsibility. And now let's talk about rejection. Because I think this is um so important because what we're talking about is really this need to belong,
Mhm.
group membership, feeling feeling like you'll be homeless,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And so this is another reason that in these these systems, the threat is always that you'll be excommunicated.
Mhm. Well, and I think we've seen, and you sort of alluded to this before, that, we've seen that's not untrue, right? So we can think about Adam Kinzinger, who, by the way, would be a great, guest as part
He
of your
is, yeah,
series.
he's on my list. I want
Good,
to
good.
get, yeah,
I was getting, yeah. Liz Cheney. We see people who have, in fact, courageously spoken up. I think Mitt Romney, people who have courageously spoken up, people who have said this is not okay, this is, not the America we live in, et cetera. And those people often, and those are all examples, of course, from politics, but those people are often, in fact, rejected. There are people who then say, my career in the Republican Party is, for all intents, over. When two whistleblowers called out what was happening at Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, blood doping company, she threatened them massively. I will sue you. I will sue your families. You will never work in Silicon Valley again. They were 22, 23 years old. They were terrified. We see with Harvey Weinstein, saying to actresses, Ashley Judd has famously talked about, I stopped getting roles.
yeah.
I
And
stopped
Mira
getting parts.
Sorvino, yeah,
Yeah, right, and Mira Sorvino. That in effect, Harvey Weinstein was getting people Oscars. He was making people millionaires, and women who spoke up or even threatened to speak up were absolutely. They weren't just threatened; they actually experienced major consequences from doing so, and that, of course, naturally leads people to stay silent.
yes. Um, and I guess I understand that. Why? I guess let's to look at it in this current moment. Um, it does seem like there are a large swath of people where this is the driving thing, right? Like they see what happened to Kinzinger and Cheney. Um, what overcomes that? In other words, like what is it that there are some people who simply is it that their identity is so tied to that group? Like in some ways, I have more sympathy for people, like not more sympathy, but like I understand like it's your livelihood, right? Like if you're an actor, you're never going to get another job again. Okay. That's one thing. I mean, people like who are say members of Congress, I mean, frankly, that should not be your lifetime job anyway. Like and it is kind of part of your job too. So I don't know, like is it when people's social identity is so tied up to that group or that label that makes fear of being ostracized so scary?
Hmm.
Um, is it that they don't identify with kind of a more, because I know one of the things I've looked at in the disinformation context is that people can be more